You know that moment when you discover someone you thought you knew was actually living a complete lie? Imagine finding out that one of Hollywood's most iconic stars fabricated nearly everything about his identity for over 6 decades. His birth certificate said one thing, his passport another, his interviews something completely different. And the wildest part? He did it all deliberately, crafting an image so mysterious that even today, people still can't separate the man from the myth. I'm talking about Yul Brynner, and trust me when I say the stories about this man are so unbelievable, so outrageous, so impossible to comprehend, that when people first heard them, they refused to accept them as truth. But stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this bald-headed legend with piercing eyes became one of the most fascinating enigmas in Hollywood history. Picture this. A man stands on the Broadway stage in 1951, completely bald, barefoot, with eyes that could pierce through steel. Nobody had ever seen anything like him. While other actors relied on elaborate costumes and hairstyles, this man stripped everything away and commanded the stage with pure presence. But who was he really? Where did he come from? These were questions that Yul Brynner spent his entire life answering differently, depending on who was asking. And here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. This wasn't a case of a celebrity protecting their privacy. This was a man who deliberately constructed multiple identities, told different stories to different people, and seemed to enjoy watching everyone try to figure out which version was true. Some said he was born on an island in the Pacific. Others claimed he was from Siberia. His own son would later write that his father's life was like peeling an onion, with each layer revealing another story, another version, another carefully crafted narrative that may or may not have been real. Let's start with the basics, except there are no basics with Yul Brynner. His birth certificate, discovered only after his death, showed he was born Yul Brynner on July 11, 1920, in Vladivostok, Russia. His father was Boris Yulievich Brynner, a Swiss-German mining engineer, and his mother was Maruzia Dmitrievna, a Russian woman from a respected family. That sounds straightforward, right? Wrong. Because Yul Brynner himself told dozens of different origin stories throughout his life. He claimed to be half Japanese and half Swiss. He said his real name was Tej Khan, and that he was born on Sakhalin Island. In some interviews, he suggested Mongol ancestry. In others, he hinted at being a gypsy. And he delivered each of these stories with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that journalists and fans believed him. Imagine having the audacity to look someone straight in the eye and tell them you're someone completely different from who you actually are, not once, not twice, but hundreds of times over decades. That takes a special kind of personality, a certain fearlessness about identity that most people simply don't possess. But why would someone do this? Why would an incredibly talented actor feel the need to mythologize his own origins? The answer lies in understanding who Yul Brynner was at his core. He was a man who understood that in Hollywood, mystery equals power. Being exotic was more valuable than being ordinary. Having an unknowable past was more intriguing than having a documented history. Brynner wasn't just selling his acting talent. He was selling an entire persona, a complete fantasy of who he could be. And in that fantasy, he could be anything he wanted. Asian, European, Middle Eastern, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was different, that he stood out, that when people saw him, they couldn't quite place him. And that ambiguity made him unforgettable. Now let's talk about how this mysterious figure ended up in Hollywood in the first place, because that story alone sounds like something out of a movie. After the Russian Revolution, young Yul and his family fled their homeland, bouncing between China and eventually settling in Paris. And this is where his life takes a turn that nobody would believe if it were fiction. At just 16 years old, this kid joined a French circus troupe and became a trapeze artist. Yes, you heard that right. Before Yul Brynner was the king of Siam, before he was a Hollywood icon, he was flying through the air under circus tents, performing death-defying acrobatic stunts. He trained his body to perfection, developed incredible physical discipline, and learned what it meant to command an audience's attention. For several years, he lived this nomadic circus life, traveling from town to town, perfecting his craft, living on the edge both literally and figuratively. But then disaster struck. During a performance, Brynner suffered a serious back injury that nearly killed him. He fell from the trapeze, and the impact left him bedridden for months. Doctors weren't sure he would ever fully recover. This could have been the end of his story, a tragic tale of a young man whose dreams were cut short by a freak accident. But Yul Brynner wasn't the type to let circumstances define him. While recovering, he started exploring other avenues for performance. He couldn't fly through the air anymore, but he could still captivate an audience. He began playing guitar with gypsy bands in Russian nightclubs around Paris, immersing himself in the bohemian artistic scene of pre-war Europe. And this is where he encountered some of the most influential artists of the 20th century, including the legendary Jean Cocteau. Jean Cocteau, for those who don't know, was one of the most important figures in French arts and literature, a poet, playwright, filmmaker, and artist who moved in the most exclusive creative circles of Europe. And somehow, this young Russian-Swiss circus performer managed to not just meet Cocteau, but to become part of his inner circle. They had a relationship that was both professional and personal, with some historians suggesting it was romantic as well. Brynner was absorbing everything from this world: art, culture, philosophy, the power of image and persona. He was learning from masters of reinvention, people who understood that identity was something you could craft, not something that was fixed from birth. This period in Paris fundamentally shaped who Yul Brynner would become, giving him the tools and the confidence to present himself as anything he wanted to be. But Europe was about to explode into the Second World War, and Brynner knew he needed to get out. In 1941, he made his way to the United States, arriving in New York with basically nothing. No connections, no money, barely speaking English. What he did have was an unshakable belief in himself and a willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. He worked odd jobs, took acting classes, and studied under the legendary Michael Chekhov, nephew of the famous playwright Anton Chekhov. Chekhov's acting method emphasized psychological gesture and the transformation of the actor's entire being into the character. For someone like Brynner, who was already comfortable with shape-shifting and reinvention, this approach was perfect. He wasn't just learning to act, he was refining his ability to become someone else entirely. And then came the role that would change everything. In 1951, Rodgers and Hammerstein were casting for a new Broadway musical called The King and I, based on the story of Anna Leonowens, a British schoolteacher who tutored the children of the King of Siam. They needed someone to play the king, and they needed someone unlike anyone else on Broadway. Someone who could be authoritative, exotic, commanding, and completely believable as an Asian monarch. Enter Yul Brynner. But there was one major problem. His look wasn't right. He had a full head of hair, and it made him look too European, too ordinary. The costume designer, Irene Sharaff, suggested something radical. What if he shaved his head completely? Brynner was initially hesitant. In the 1950s, being bald was not considered attractive. It certainly wasn't fashionable. But he trusted the instinct, and one day, he picked up a razor and shaved his entire head. What happened next was pure magic. When Brynner stepped onto that stage, completely bald, barefoot, wearing the costume of the King of Siam, something extraordinary occurred. He didn't just look different, he looked iconic. The bald head gave him an air of timelessness, of mystery, of power. Combined with his piercing eyes and his commanding stage presence, he became absolutely unforgettable. The show was a massive hit, and Brynner's performance was unlike anything Broadway had ever seen. He won the Tony Award for Best Actor, and suddenly, everyone wanted to know, who is this guy? Where did he come from? And Brynner, being Brynner, gave different answers to different people, only deepening the mystique. For the next 4 years, Brynner played the King of Siam on Broadway, performing the role over 1,000 times. Think about that for a moment. Most actors do a Broadway run for a few months, maybe a year if it's a huge hit. Brynner did it for 4 years straight, perfecting every gesture, every line, every moment. He wasn't just performing a role. He was inhabiting it so completely that the line between Yul Brynner and the King of Siam began to blur. People started to wonder if the commanding, authoritative personality they saw on stage was actually just Brynner being himself. And in many ways, it was. The role gave him permission to be as dominant, as demanding, and as larger-than-life as he naturally was. In 1956, Hollywood came calling. 20th Century Fox decided to make a film version of The King and I, and there was never any question about who would play the king. But film is different from stage. On stage, you can rely on projection and broad gestures. On film, the camera captures every tiny movement, every flicker of emotion. Some stage actors can't make that transition. Yul Brynner not only made it, he mastered it. His film performance was even more powerful than his stage work, because the camera loved him. Those piercing eyes, that bald head, the way he could convey authority with just a look, all of it translated perfectly to the big screen. The film was a massive success, and Brynner won the Academy Award for Best Actor. At the age of 36, this man who had reinvented himself multiple times had reached the absolute pinnacle of Hollywood success. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because success didn't mellow Yul Brynner. If anything, it amplified all of his most extreme personality traits. And those traits were considerable. Brynner had an ego the size of a mountain. He was demanding, difficult, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. On set, he expected everyone to defer to him, to recognize his authority, to essentially treat him like the actual king of Siam. And for the most part, people did, because his talent was undeniable. But this approach to life and work meant that Brynner constantly clashed with other strong personalities. And in Hollywood, there's no shortage of big egos. The most famous feud in Yul Brynner's career, and possibly one of the most legendary feuds in Hollywood history, was with Steve McQueen on the set of The Magnificent Seven in 1960. Now, if you don't know the backstory, this was a Western remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, about 7 gunfighters hired to protect a Mexican village. Brynner was cast as Chris Adams, the leader of the group, essentially the star of the film. Steve McQueen, who was still a rising star at the time, was cast in a supporting role as Vin Tanner. This should have been straightforward. Established star leads film, supporting actor does his job, everyone goes home happy. But McQueen was not interested in being anyone's supporting player. He was hungry, ambitious, and absolutely determined to steal every scene he was in. And this is where it gets fascinating, because what happened on the set of The Magnificent Seven was essentially a war of egos played out through performance. McQueen understood that he couldn't outact Brynner in traditional ways. Brynner was a trained stage actor with decades of experience. So McQueen did something different. He started employing all sorts of tricks to draw the audience's attention to himself. In scenes where he and Brynner were together, McQueen would fidget with his hat. He'd shake shotgun shells near his ear. He'd make small movements and gestures that would catch the viewer's eye. He was essentially scene-stealing through distraction, and it drove Yul Brynner absolutely insane. Brynner was used to commanding attention through sheer presence. McQueen was grabbing attention through constant motion. 2 completely different styles of acting, 2 massive egos, and 1 film set. You can imagine how well that went. The tension escalated throughout the filming. Brynner confronted McQueen multiple times, grabbing him by the shoulder in front of the cast and crew, essentially trying to physically intimidate him into backing down. But McQueen didn't back down. If anything, he doubled down on his approach. The director, John Sturges, was caught in the middle, trying to manage these 2 enormous personalities while still making a good film. And somehow, incredibly, the movie worked. The tension between Brynner and McQueen actually added to the film, giving it an edge that might not have been there if everyone had gotten along. On screen, their dynamic was electric. Off-screen, they could barely stand to be in the same room. Years later, Steve McQueen would actually apologize to Brynner. When McQueen was dying of cancer, he reached out and made peace, acknowledging that he had been difficult during the filming. Brynner, for his part, accepted the apology. But at the time, the feud was real, bitter, and all-consuming. It became one of the most talked-about behind-the-scenes stories in Hollywood, and it revealed something important about Yul Brynner's character. He demanded respect, he demanded to be the center of attention, and he would fight anyone who challenged that position. This wasn't just about ego for the sake of ego. This was about a man who had built his entire identity on being unique, on being the most interesting person in any room, and he couldn't tolerate anything that threatened that carefully constructed image. And then there was his rivalry with Ingrid Bergman on the set of Anastasia in 1956. Bergman was one of the most respected actresses in the world, a multiple Oscar winner, beloved by audiences and critics alike. You'd think Brynner would have been honored to work with her. Instead, he made her life miserable. He was rude, dismissive, and constantly tried to upstage her. Bergman later described him as one of the most difficult co-stars she'd ever worked with. And this is coming from someone who had worked with some of the biggest directors and actors in film history. The irony? Both Brynner and Bergman won Academy Awards that year, him for The King and I, and her for Anastasia. They were both at the ceremony, both won, and reportedly barely acknowledged each other. Even in triumph, Brynner couldn't let go of his need to be the dominant presence. But let's talk about Brynner's personal life, because if his professional life was complicated, his personal life was absolutely chaotic. He was married 4 times, and each marriage was its own dramatic saga. His first wife was actress Virginia Gilmore, whom he married in 1944. They had 1 son together, Yul Brynner, who would later write a memoir about his father that revealed many of the truths behind Yul's carefully constructed myths. That marriage lasted until 1960 and ended in divorce. His second wife was Chilean model Doris Kleiner, a relationship that was passionate but tumultuous. That marriage also ended in divorce. His third wife was Jacqueline Thion de la Chaume, a French socialite. Also ended in divorce. Are you seeing a pattern here? Brynner was not a man built for domestic stability. His fourth and final marriage was to Kathy Lee, a Malaysian-born ballerina who was 26 years old when they married in 1983. Brynner was 62. She was young enough to be his daughter, but by all accounts, this relationship was different from his earlier marriages. Perhaps because he was older, or perhaps because he knew his time was limited due to his cancer diagnosis, but he seemed more settled with Kathy. They remained married until his death, and she was with him at the end, which tells you something about the depth of that connection. But beyond his marriages, Brynner had a legendary reputation for romantic affairs with some of the most famous women in Hollywood. He had relationships with Marlene Dietrich, the German-American actress and singer who was herself a legend of Hollywood's golden age. Their affair reportedly lasted for 10 years and was passionate and intense. He was involved with Judy Garland, the troubled star of The Wizard of Oz, at a time when she was struggling with addiction and personal demons. He had an affair with Joan Crawford, one of the biggest stars of classic Hollywood, known for her own fierce personality and demanding nature. It's almost impressive that 2 egos that large could coexist in the same relationship, even temporarily. He was also rumored to have had a relationship with Ingrid Bergman, despite their professional conflicts, proving that with Brynner, everything was complicated. And here's where things get even more interesting. Brynner's sexuality was far more complex than the public knew during his lifetime. While he was married to women and had very public affairs with famous actresses, there were also persistent rumors and later confirmations about relationships with men. His connection with Jean Cocteau in Paris was likely romantic as well as artistic. There were other male partners throughout his life, though he never publicly acknowledged these relationships. In the 1950s and 1960s, being openly bisexual would have been career suicide in Hollywood, so Brynner kept that aspect of his life private. But the people who knew him well understood that his romantic life included both women and men, that his sexuality was as fluid and unbound by convention as every other aspect of his identity. This understanding of Brynner's sexuality adds another layer to his constant reinvention. He was a man living in an era when conformity was expected, when there were clear rules about how you were supposed to be, who you were supposed to love, what kind of life you were supposed to live. And Brynner rejected all of it. He created his own rules, lived by his own code, and refused to be limited by anyone else's expectations. Yes, this made him difficult. Yes, it made him controversial. But it also made him free in a way that most people never experience. Now let's talk about something that seems superficial, but was actually central to Brynner's image: his iconic bald head. Remember, he started shaving his head for The King and I in 1951. What's remarkable is that he kept that look for the remaining 34 years of his life. In an era when men went to great lengths to hide baldness, when toupees were standard for Hollywood leading men, Brynner turned his bald head into a trademark. It became so associated with him that even today, if you show someone a picture of Yul Brynner, the first thing they notice is that gleaming bald head. But here's what most people don't know. Brynner was already starting to lose his hair when he made the decision to shave it all off. He recognized that male pattern baldness would eventually make him look older and less attractive by conventional standards. So instead of fighting it, instead of trying to cover it up, he leaned into it completely. He turned a potential weakness into his greatest visual asset. And the bald head did something else. It made him timeless. When you look at photographs of Yul Brynner from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s, he looks essentially the same. While other actors visibly aged, while you could watch their hairlines recede and their faces change, Brynner maintained a consistent image. That bald head, combined with his intense physical fitness regimen, meant that he could play similar roles across decades without seeming out of place. It was brilliant personal branding before personal branding was even a concept. Brynner was also an accomplished photographer, something that many people don't know. He was serious about it, too, not just a celebrity dabbling in a hobby. He published several books of his photography, and his work was exhibited in galleries. His photographs often captured backstage moments, fellow actors, scenes from his travels around the world. Through photography, he could control the image in a different way, could decide what stories to tell and how to tell them. It was another form of creation, another way of shaping reality to match his vision. Everything Brynner did, from acting to photography to the stories he told about his life, was about control. Control of his image, control of how people perceived him, control of his own narrative. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Brynner continued to work steadily in film and theater. He appeared in movies like The Brothers Karamazov, Solomon and Sheba, The Magnificent Seven and its sequel, Westworld, where he played a robot gunslinger in one of the first films to seriously explore artificial intelligence, and many others. Some of these films were successful, others less so. But Brynner himself remained a draw. People went to see a Yul Brynner film because they wanted to see him, that commanding presence, those piercing eyes, that undeniable charisma. But his greatest role would always be the King of Siam. Over the course of his life, Brynner performed that role more than 4,600 times on stage. Let me repeat that, 4,600 times. That's not a typo. He would do Broadway runs, then tour productions, then revivals, again and again throughout his career. In 1977, he returned to Broadway for a revival of The King and I that ran for several years. In 1985, he was in the middle of yet another run when he became too ill to continue. By that point, he had been playing that role for 34 years, longer than many actors have entire careers. The King of Siam wasn't just his most famous role. It had essentially become part of his identity. He once said that he thought of himself as the king, that the character and the man had merged into one person. Given how much of his life was performance anyway, this seems oddly fitting. In 1983, Yul Brynner was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had been a heavy smoker his entire adult life, going through multiple packs a day. For decades, he had ignored warnings about smoking, had dismissed concerns about his health. Now, the disease that kills thousands of smokers every year was claiming him too. But here's where Brynner did something remarkable, something that would become his final great performance and perhaps his most important legacy. He decided to use his own dying as a way to save lives. In January 1985, just months before his death, Brynner sat down to film an anti-smoking public service announcement. This wasn't a typical PSA with statistics and doctors. This was a dying man speaking directly to the camera, speaking to the future, knowing that his words would be broadcast after his death. In the commercial, Brynner looks directly into the camera and says, "Now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke. If I could take back that smoking, we wouldn't be talking about any cancer." I'm convinced of that. The stark honesty of it, the raw vulnerability from a man known for his commanding presence and controlled image, was devastating. This was Yul Brynner stripped of all the mythology he had built around himself, just a man facing death and trying to do something meaningful with his last moments. The commercial was released just days after Brynner's death on October 10, 1985. He died in New York City at the age of 65, with his wife Kathy by his side. The impact of that PSA was enormous. It aired during high-profile broadcasts and reached millions of viewers. For many people, especially young people in the 1980s, it was a shocking wake-up call about the real dangers of smoking. Here was this iconic figure, this man who had seemed almost superhuman in his presence and power, reduced by cigarettes to a dying patient with a warning. Health organizations credited Brynner's commercial with inspiring thousands of people to quit smoking and discouraging countless others from starting. In death, Yul Brynner did something he rarely did in life. He told a completely honest truth without any embellishment or mythology. After his death, the full extent of Brynner's fabrications about his life began to emerge. His son Rock Brynner wrote a memoir called Yul, The Man Who Would Be King, that revealed many of the truths about his father's actual origins, his personality, his relationships. Biographers dug into records and found the real birth certificate, the actual family history, the documented facts that contradicted so many of the stories Brynner had told. And as these revelations came out, people had two reactions. Some felt betrayed, felt that Brynner had lied to them, had made fools of everyone who believed his exotic origin stories. Others saw it differently. They saw a man who understood that in Hollywood, you don't just sell your talent, you sell a dream. And Yul Brynner sold one of the most compelling dreams in entertainment history. Think about what he actually accomplished. He fled revolutionary Russia as a child, performed in a circus, nearly died in an accident, reinvented himself as a musician in Paris, emigrated to America with nothing, became one of Broadway's biggest stars, won an Oscar, became a Hollywood icon, and maintained that status for over 3 decades. That's the real story, and it's actually more impressive than any of the myths he created. Because the myths were just window dressing. The substance, the actual achievement, was that through sheer force of will and extraordinary talent, this man made himself into exactly who he wanted to be. Was Yul Brynner difficult to work with? Absolutely. Was he egotistical? Without question. Did he manipulate the truth and create an elaborate mythology around himself? Constantly. But he was also one of the most magnetic performers in Hollywood history. When he was on screen, you couldn't look away. When he was on stage, he commanded every moment. He brought intensity and commitment to his work that few actors have ever matched. He performed the same role over 4,600 times and made it fresh every single time. He turned his dying moments into a message that saved lives. And he lived exactly the life he wanted to live, on his own terms, by his own rules, regardless of what anyone else thought. The mystery of Yul Brynner isn't really about where he was born or what his ancestry was. The real mystery is how one person can contain so many contradictions, so many different identities, so many versions of himself, and somehow make it all work. He was Russian and Swiss and cosmopolitan and exotic. He was straight and bisexual. He was a tyrant on set and a caring father. He was an egomaniac and an artist committed to his craft. He was a liar about his past and brutally honest about his death. All of these things were true simultaneously, and that's what made him fascinating. In the years since his death, Brynner's reputation has only grown. New generations discover The King and I and are captivated by this bald man with piercing eyes who dominates every scene. Film students watch The Magnificent Seven and study the rivalry between him and McQueen. Westworld has been rebooted as a prestige TV series, introducing new audiences to Brynner's original robot gunslinger. His anti-smoking PSA is still shown in schools and health classes as an example of effective public health messaging. And people still debate about who he really was, what was true and what was myth, trying to solve the puzzle of Yul Brynner decades after his death. Here's what I think the real truth is. Yul Brynner understood something fundamental about identity that most people never grasp. He understood that who you are isn't fixed. It's not determined solely by where you're born or who your parents are or what circumstances you start with. Identity is something you create, something you perform, something you can shape and reshape throughout your life. The stories he told about his origins weren't lies so much as they were possibilities, alternative versions of himself that could have been true, that felt true to him in some essential way. He was all of those identities and none of them. He was whoever he needed to be in any given moment, and somehow he made that multiplicity work. When people say nobody believed these Yul Brynner stories until they watched this, what they really mean is that the truth about him was so complex, so layered, so deliberately obscured, that it took decades for the full picture to emerge. And even now, with biographies written and records uncovered and testimonies from people who knew him, there's still mystery. There are still aspects of his life and personality that remain unknowable, questions that can't be definitively answered, contradictions that can't be resolved. And maybe that's exactly how Yul Brynner would have wanted it. A man who spent his life creating mystery wouldn't want everything explained. He'd want some secrets to remain, some questions to stay unanswered, some part of himself to forever be just out of reach. The legacy of Yul Brynner is ultimately about the power of reinvention. It's about taking control of your own story and refusing to be limited by other people's expectations or definitions. It's about understanding that performance isn't just something actors do on stage. It's something we all do every day, and the people who do it consciously, who shape their persona deliberately, often accomplish extraordinary things. Brynner showed that you can be whoever you want to be if you commit to it completely, if you believe it totally, if you live it authentically even when it's not factually accurate. So when you think about Yul Brynner now, don't just think about the bald head or the piercing eyes or the iconic roles. Think about a man who understood that life is performance, that identity is fluid, that truth is sometimes less important than the story you tell about yourself. Think about someone who fled revolution, survived tragedy, reinvented himself multiple times, conquered Broadway and Hollywood, had legendary feuds and legendary affairs, and at the end, used his death to save lives. That's a story worth telling, and it's all true, even the parts that aren't. Yul Brynner proved that the most unbelievable stories are often the real ones. And his story, in all its contradictions and complexities, remains one of the most unbelievable in Hollywood history.